At the end of Avengers Endgame, Chris Evans' MCU version of Captain America got his happy ending when he went back in time to return the Infinity Stones to their original points in history, but didn't return. Instead, he opted to seek out Hayley Atwell's Peggy Carter in the 1940s, where he stayed and lived out a happily married life with her. And that essentially means Cap lived out a whole life that we'll probably never get to see. And in this video, we'll run you through some of the things he might have done in that alternate timeline.
And suit up.
Here's an interesting idea. Do we really think Captain America would have gone into the past and just left his own body in the ice? It would be pretty creepy knowing that you were living your best life completely aware that an alternate version of your body was just laying frozen and lifeless, especially when you knew exactly where it was. Of course, this would leave Cap with two interesting options. He could have his other body woken up so that two Captain Americas existed at the same time, or he could inform S.H.I.E.L.D. of his alternate counterpart's whereabouts and instruct them to keep him on ice until he died or retired, so that another Captain America would be around to continue his legacy.
Pretty much.
In fact, assuming time travel is always invented, Cap could make a loop occur in which his future self always ensures the well-being of his own past frozen body. Wow, we've only just started and we can already tell this is going to be a complicated video.
That's something the world sorely needs.
When Steve Rogers went into the ice in 1945, he did so believing that his best friend, Sebastian Stan's Bucky Barnes, had died when he fell from an advanced Hydra train into the icy river Danube. However, in 2014, a couple of years after he was defrosted, he discovered that his friend was actually very much alive and had been fitted with a metal arm and brainwashed by Hydra to become their most dangerous assassin. So with that knowledge, when Rogers arrived back in the 1940s, surely one of the first things he would have done is find his friend and save him from a life as Hydra's puppet. It would actually be interesting to learn what Bucky would have made out of his life, had that happened first time around, and equally interesting to see him interacting with an older Steve Rogers who'd have lots of stories from the future to tell. From the moment he first became Captain America in 1943, Steve Rogers went up against Hydra and ultimately prevented the Red Skull from bombing a load of major cities and conquering the world. He went into the ice believing he defeated the evil group, only to learn more than 70 years later that the organization had been infiltrating S.H.I.E.L.D. for that entire time, growing inside the organization like a parasite.
Hail, Hydra.
Nobody within S.H.I.E.L.D. who was fighting on the side of good had any idea about this, so it's probably fair to assume that Rogers would have informed them about Hydra's plans before they were ever able to execute them. A future with no Hydra in it would have made the world a very different and much better place. And a lot of MCU events on both the big and small screens would have played out very differently in their absence. At the end of Captain America: The First Avenger, just before Rogers crashed into the icy ocean, he'd watched the Red Skull seemingly die when he touched the Tesseract. However, it would later be revealed that the Nazi villain was actually alive and well, having been transported to Vormir to guard the Soul Stone. Now, when Rogers returned the Soul Stone to Vormir at the end of Avengers Endgame, he would probably have seen the Red Skull, but rather than get into a fight and risk his plans with Peggy, he probably just dropped the stone off and left. However, with the Tesseract in the ocean back in the 1940s, he may well have obtained it, informed his allies that Red Skull was alive, and used it to travel to Vormir and kill him once and for all. It's hard to imagine Rogers being anything other than restless, knowing his nemesis was still alive and well. With knowledge of future events, Steve Rogers would surely do everything in his power in the past to ensure the Chitauri invasion of Earth either never happens or is stopped immediately. He knows, for example, that it was the Tesseract that drew Loki and the aliens to Earth in the first place, in order to acquire it for Thanos, so he might have the powerful item removed from the planet, or even have it destroyed given his thoughts about it. Alternatively, he could just provide S.H.I.E.L.D. with the intel needed to defeat them quickly, which they could in turn pass on to the Avengers once they form in the new timeline. Knowing that Tony Stark directing the nuclear missile into their mothership is what defeated the Chitauri, the heroes in the alternate timeline could do that as soon as their portal opens, courtesy of Captain America. It would make for a very boring Avengers movie, though. Of course, after the Chitauri invasion, the next big Avengers conflict Captain America took part in following his awakening in the 2010s was the conflict with Ultron, which culminated in the tremendously damaging Battle of Sokovia. Tony Stark and Bruce Banner inadvertently created the evil robot when they were looking to make the world a safer place, which would enable them to retire from their superhero duties. And knowing that they might do the same thing again in the future, Steve Rogers would do everything in his power to prevent it from happening. He would surely have S.H.I.E.L.D. warned about the dangers of artificial intelligence and provide intel on the Mind Stone, pointing out that should it ever come to Earth in the new timeline, meddling with it could be a very dangerous prospect. There are better ways to protect the planet, and with his knowledge, Rogers would undoubtedly want to help to discover them, even if Vision is sacrificed in the process.
Oh, this'll clear it up.
Without a doubt, the biggest conflict Captain America ever took part in alongside the Avengers was the Infinity War in 2018, and of course the subsequent events that took place in Avengers Endgame 5 years later. With knowledge of these events, he'd definitely want to prevent them from ever happening once he returned to the 1940s, and the best way he could do that would either be to destroy the Infinity Stones, or at the very least, have them all found and guarded by non-evil characters. With that in mind, if he didn't just have the stones destroyed, Cap's return to the past might even result in the formation of the Infinity Watch, with himself and other carefully appointed guardians of the Infinity Stones ensuring that none of them ever fall into the wrong hands. Of course, destroying them would definitely be the best option. There's absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. On a somewhat related note to the potential formation of the Infinity Watch, Steve Rogers might look for allies in the past in different circles, including mysticism, and the Ancient One would be an ideal candidate. Rogers would be aware that she had lived for a long time, and would no doubt know about the fact that she helped with the Avengers' plans to undo the decimation by giving the Time Stone to Bruce Banner, and Cap himself would have given it back to her in 2012. In the past, he might make an ally of her, pooling the resources of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Masters of the Mystic Arts to make the world a safer place for future generations, and warning her about what the Time Stone is used for in the future. He might convince her to destroy it, or even recruit her to be part of a newly formed Infinity Watch. Either way, he'd surely drop in to say, hello. One of Captain America's most reliable allies following his defrosting was undoubtedly Thor. The God of Thunder was also one of the most powerful, and he's an ally Earth could have done with long before he first arrived there. Thor just so happens to be more than 1,500 years old, so when Cap went back in time, the Asgardian would have been very much alive. With access to the Tesseract, which of course was in the ocean in the 1940s, Cap could quite easily travel to Asgard to introduce himself to Thor in the past. An earlier alliance with Earth could be formed, and Cap could warn Thor about the path Loki was on, which could in turn indirectly keep Earth safer in the future. If Earth had had good relations with Asgard since the 40s, it might become a very different place in the future, and indeed vice versa. In Avengers Endgame, James Rhodes suggested going back in time to kill Thanos when he was a baby. While that wouldn't have helped the Avengers given the rules of time travel in the MCU, it does provide us with an idea of what Steve Rogers might do in this new reality. Of course, Thanos wouldn't have been a baby in the 1940s. He's undoubtedly a lot older than that, but he would have been younger, less experienced, and certainly not in possession of an Infinity Stone. With that in mind, Captain America might choose to launch an offensive against the younger Mad Titan, perhaps using the Infinity Stones that are on Earth to nip him in the bud early, so he doesn't pose a threat to the universe going forward. With the Tesseract in the ocean and the Time Stone with the Ancient One, that's definitely enough power to take the prune-shinned villain down. Steve Rogers was aware that he was the first successful attempt at creating a super soldier, but when he woke up in 2011, he would soon come to learn that the serum was never truly replicated. That being said, various alternate variations of it were made, with Bucky Barnes being given one of them. And Rogers would know that it could be a force for good, so maybe in the past he would help to create more individuals like him. With Dr. Erskine's death still fresh in the memories of those living in the 1940s, Rogers might offer his blood for further experimentation and seize Hydra's research into super soldiers, in order to provide the United States, and indeed the world, with an army of soldiers with peak human physical attributes. Rogers isn't selfish, and he doesn't like the idea of being special, so it would be very in character for him to share his power. Given Captain America's advanced experience in the field, his knowledge of the organization in question, and indeed his knowledge of the future and the threats the world will face, who could possibly be a better choice to become the Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. in the alternate timeline than him? Its leaders in its various forms have included the likes of Chester Phillips, Howard Stark, Nick Fury, Phil Coulson, and indeed the love of Steve Rogers' life, Peggy Carter. But with him around for the organization's inception, he would surely have to be considered, even if it meant treading on the toes of his own more than capable wife. As a man of purity and integrity, he would surely set S.H.I.E.L.D. on the right path, ensuring the organization did everything the right way, and went about protecting Earth from evil in the best and most efficient manner possible. Steve Rogers, Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. It just works.
Understood.
Given the impact Tony Stark had on Steve Rogers' life, both good and bad, it's hard to imagine him going back to a time when Tony's dad was alive and not mentioning his son to him. Of course, Rogers being Rogers, he'd be unlikely to mention Tony's flaws or the big fight that he had with him during the events of Captain America Civil War. He'd only mention his brilliance, his development of the arc reactor, the whole Iron Man thing, his mastery of time travel, and so forth. It might make Howard appreciate his son more when he's born, and prompt him to spend more time with him, knowing what a brilliant and brave individual he'd become.
Doth mother know you weareth her drapes?
But then, would that change Tony in the new timeline? Would having more of his father's respect from an early age have made him different? Was it even ultimately to Tony's benefit that Howard's largely ignored him? Who knows? Here's an interesting idea. You know how Steve Rogers traveled back in time, putting the Infinity Stones back where they came from? Well, what if returning the Soul Stone back to the moment Natasha Romanoff sacrificed her life to obtain it brought her back to life? A soul for a soul and all that. If Rogers came face to face with his resurrected fellow Avenger and friend, he might offer her a new life in the past, where the red in her ledger would officially be wiped out, as none of the nefarious actions she carried out before joining S.H.I.E.L.D. would be on record at that point. If she was to join Cap in the past, she'd be a very useful asset to S.H.I.E.L.D., as they became a more established organization. And the Black Widow's exploits in the 1940s would make for a potentially excellent movie. Just saying, Marvel. This is quite a cute entry, and it's a far cry from all the totally badass heroic stuff we've talked about so far in the video. But what if the very first thing Steve Rogers did upon his arrival back in the 1940s was to arrange a dance lesson, so he was immediately ready to blow Peggy Carter's mind upon his reunion with her? Just imagine that moment. Peggy sat mourning Captain America's death when he walks into her office, lifts her up, kisses her, and sweeps her off her feet with the most amazing and perfectly choreographed waltz, avoiding stepping on her toes even once. And just envisioning it in our minds brings a genuine tear to our eyes. Knowing what the Avengers offered the world after he woke up in 2011, Steve Rogers may opt to start his own team of superheroes back in the 40s. He could recruit Bucky first, and then the duo could head off on a recruitment mission around the world. If the MCU is anything like the comics, superheroes will have been around for a long time, and one recruit could come in the form of Captain Britain. Brian Braddock, Captain Britain's real name, was teased in Avengers Endgame, and was obviously active in 1970, which is when he was name-dropped. Had the mystical hero been around in the 1940s, he'd be a great addition to the team, and would take the whole initiative international, even in its early form. Other recruits could include Thor, Namor, the Ancient One, and countless other characters from the Marvel catalog. They'd certainly get the Earth well prepared for all the future MCU threats. If Steve Rogers still wanted to continue doing good upon his return to the past, but at the same time didn't want anybody to know he'd returned, he could go about his evil fighting business Vigilante style. Seriously, how cool is it imagining Captain America as a Batman-style superhero, patrolling the mean streets at night, taking down bad guys from the shadows? Awesome, right? New York isn't exactly Gotham, and it certainly didn't have anywhere near that much crime in the 40s, but having someone watching over it at any point wouldn't be a bad thing. It would be kind of reminiscent of Rogers' time as Nomad in the comics, when he abandoned the Captain America name and the stars and stripes and opted for a darker costume that included a cape. Of course, he actually tripped over that cape at one point, so in hindsight, this might actually be a bad idea.
No capes!
You know, given the resources at Peggy Carter's disposal, there's every chance Steve Rogers could be given a completely new identity in the alternate timeline, which may even allow him to live a somewhat normal life, doing a normal everyday job. In the comics, Rogers is actually a talented artist, and he has in fact been known to draw the comics that Captain America appears in, so he could draw or paint for a living, or even become an art teacher. Sure, people would often mistake him for Captain America, but he could just claim to be a very convincing lookalike. In spite of all these things we've discussed with regards to what Steve Rogers might have done in the alternate timeline, the fact is he might have just retired completely and let other events transpire naturally. Given the skill set of both him and Peggy Carter, they could very easily have kept him a secret and hidden him away, allowing him to live a peaceful home life away from those who might seek to get him back in the game, so to speak. The truth is, he absolutely earned it. He helped to save the world on several occasions and even helped to save the entire universe, courageously putting his life on the line without any hesitation. Maggie Peggy kept doing her thing, even keeping a photograph of Skinny Steve on her desk to maintain the charade, knowing she was going home to Captain America, the house husband, every day. We know Steve Rogers went back in time at the end of Avengers Endgame for the express purpose of getting to live out a happy life with Peggy Carter, and we also know he ended up getting married to her, which provides us with the question of whether or not the couple went on to have children. It's an intriguing prospect, the offspring of a secret agent and a super soldier, and you have to wonder what would become of someone with such strong parental role models. Of course, if the kid or kids were to inherit Steve's DNA as he was before he became a super soldier, they might end up being weak and sickly. It's more than likely, however, that they ended up being absolutely badass. And a son or daughter of Captain America movie set in the alternate timeline could certainly be fun to see in the MCU franchise.
And you wonder why you waited so long for something so disappointing.
Well, guys, we could do this all day, but alas, that's the end of the video. What else do you think Captain America might have done in the alternate timeline? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Screen Rant for more great videos just like this one. See you next time.